How do you throw a lead hook? Or how do you teach a lead hook? There are so many different variations, this is actually a very difficult question. Do you do it like this example? Or do you keep your feet planted? Do you turn your hips 90 degrees? Do you step and switch your stance? Do you duck and slip and square your stance? Or do you fly through the air? As we can see from these examples, an effective hook can come in many shapes and sizes.
This video is going to take an in-depth look at the mechanics of common hook variations in addition to the common denominators behind all hook punches. I believe this video is the most in-depth discussion of the hook that you will probably find anywhere. And a fair warning, there is a lot of science, a lot of biomechanics, a lot of details. But I try to keep it entertaining with live examples. I hope you enjoy the video. I'm going to offer this quote from Bruce Lee in case this or any other video you see ever contradicts your preconceived notions.
The biggest point of contention about the lead hook is whether to pivot the foot or not. Here in an example you see that the lead foot is planted and it does not pivot. Another example of a knockout where the lead foot is planted and it does not pivot. Now here's an example where the lead foot pivots on the hook. Okay, we see a still example of the lead foot pivoting upon impact. Another example of that lead foot pivoting as the hook lands. So these examples show that both methods are very effective. The method that you will use though will depend on your weight distribution and the situation. You may be wondering how both methods are effective. To understand this, we have to look at the role of the feet in initiating and generating power. Let's look at this example of a right cross. We see here that power is actually initiated from pushing off the foot. Pivoting then occurs as a follow through. Same thing for the left hook. First the weight is pushed from the foot and then a pivot occurs after the weight is pushed off of that foot. The power is initiated through pushing from the feet. An easy way to remember this is to push before you pivot. You push your body weight towards a supporting leg and then the pivot occurs as a follow through or continuation of the motion. Whether or not the front foot pivot depends on two things. The follow through, or if the motion was continued through the lower body, and it also depends on the weight distribution. If there is a lot of weight on the front foot, it will not pivot. As you see here from this example, if there's weight planted on my foot, I can't rotate. I have to push the weight off of my foot to be able to rotate. Rotating with weight on my foot would actually lead to injury, so I have to push the weight off to rotate. Locking a joint into place and causing it to rotate, after all, is how a heel hook and other leg attacks work. So if you see the front foot planted, it means that the majority of the body weight was distributed onto the front foot, and it also means there was a lack of follow through the lower body during or after the punch, and it's not a bad thing. This is actually a very, very effective way of doing a hook. Now let's look at examples where the lead foot does pivot, and we're going to talk about the mechanics of how to effectively pivot on the lead foot, and it's not how it is typically taught. It's commonly taught to dig the lead foot into the ground as you're pivoting here, grinding the lead foot into the ground as you're pivoting on that leg, which is actually very ineffective because friction is not your friend in this situation. The friction actually slows down the rotation and makes for a very ineffective rotation. Again, the actual effective way to pivot is to push weight onto a supporting leg and then let the other leg rotate freely with very little weight on it on a small surface area. The majority of people who have trained a lot or done a lot of sparring will probably do this naturally, but the main point I'm trying to make is don't insist that your students or you try to dig your foot into the ground when you punch, as it is commonly taught. In this close-up example, you'll see that I'm digging my lead foot into the ground as I pivot. It's actually very ineffective. The more effective way is here is to push the weight off onto the supporting leg and then pivot on a small surface.
As we see here in this example, George Foreman has his front foot facing forward and most of the body weight is on the front foot. We see as the punch lands, the front foot is still facing forward, although angled slightly inward. We see here in the follow-through phase of the punch that the foot has been fully rotated because the weight has been pushed off the lead foot and all of the body weight now is on the supporting leg, which is the rear foot. The front foot is very light and the toes here are only grazing the mat. The next method of foot pivot we're going to look at is pivoting in mid-air, letting the feet leave the mat and pivoting in the air. Again, in this variation, notice how the fighter pushes off his feet and then pivots in mid-air. This enables a very effective rotation without any friction underneath the feet. A great, although unrelated example of this occurs in judo. When somebody pivots to do a throw in judo, their feet often leave the mat to enable an effective pivot. To further illustrate the point of effective pivoting with the feet, let's look at this example of the back step throw in judo or wrestling. It is typically taught in a very static fashion where the feet are digging into the ground, but in actuality, when the throw is done, the feet leave the ground and pivot in midair without any friction. This enables, again, a more effective pivot. Let's see this example in live action with Taitoshi. Notice how the fighter pushes up his feet and then pivots. Look at the feet mid-air. They land, and now he completes a very beautiful throw. Same example, look at the feet pivot in midair. So to review, power is not initiated through pivoting, rather it is initiated through pushing off the feet and transferring the weight. Pivoting is a follow-through of that motion, and the most effective pivots occur with as little weight as possible, often in mid-air. Here's a great example from tennis. Notice how the foot only rotates after the weight is taken off of it, and the rotation happens in mid-air to reduce friction. To further illustrate how universal these principles are, let's look at this example from golf. Notice how the feet push and then the pivot is a follow-through. Notice how power is generated from transferring weight from the feet, and then after all the weight is taken off that side, the foot then freely rotates on a small surface. So there are two commandments of pivoting from the feet. Push before you pivot, and pivot with as little friction as possible. There are many effective variations of the hook punch, but for our discussion, let us focus on the three primary stances that the fighter is in when he throws the hook. The first stance we see is a staggered stance, one foot in front of the other. The second stance is a squared stance, where the feet are on the same line parallel to one another. The third stance is a switching stance, where the stance turns 90 degrees from where it was, the hip now facing the opponent. And another variation of this is scissoring the legs, where the legs switch places. Let's begin with hooks thrown from the staggered stance. This is the common stance in boxing, kickboxing, and MMA. Notice in this variation the front foot is flat and it pretty much stays planted. There's very little rotation, if at all, maybe some angling into the foot slightly, but it stays planted. The weight's on the front foot and there's no real pivot. You might see this variation of a hook following a hook to the body. So if there's a shovel hook to the body, oftentimes after that there will be a hook to the head without pivoting on the front foot, because most of the weight is locked and loaded onto the front foot. Here's an excellent example with Ernesto Hoost. Notice he throws the hook to the body, his weight's remaining forward, and then he throws the hook to the face. In this example, we can see that the foot is pointed forward, and there is just the slightest degree of internal rotation here at the knee, but the foot is flat and not rotated. In this example, again with Carlos Condit, notice how his lead foot stays planted even after the hook lands. What we are going to call hook variation number 2 is very similar to the first one, but the main difference is that the front foot is going to pivot or rotate. So what we see here is that the hook is thrown, there's weight in the front foot, and then as a follow-through to continue the motion, the front foot pivots or rotates. And it does this on a small surface after the majority of the weight has been pushed off of the front foot. Again, George Foreman showing a hook similar to variation number 2, pivoting the front foot when he hooks from a staggered stance. Now let's look at hook variations that are thrown from a square stance. The hook from a square stance is actually a very powerful way to throw a hook. As you see here in this example, I throw a right cross, I step forward to regain balance, stand squares, and I throw the hook. When throwing the hook from the square stance, you can transfer weight from one side to the other. This is a very powerful hook because I'm able to transfer weight onto my supporting leg, which is in line with my front leg. That means that I can transfer weight in the direction of the punch, as opposed to punching from a staggered stance where I have to transfer my weight backward. Another example from the rear, if you watch the video on the right cross, you know that the foot often travels forward after a good cross is thrown, and this lets the foot square up for a perfect hook from a squared stance. Here's a great example of a hook thrown from a square stance. Notice how square the stance is. The weight is transferred to the support leg, and after that the foot rotates for a very powerful and effective hook. Here's a great example of Daniel Guita, Glory Kickboxing. In the second clip, it's easier to see that he squares his feet when he throws the hook. Here we see leg kick lands, and he squares his feet, throws the hook, and a knockdown. In this example of slipping a punch, Rampage comes out of the slip, squares his feet, and throws a very, very powerful hook. Notice that by squaring his stance, Rampage is able to push his weight onto a support foot, which is in the direction of the punch. A square stance also enables the fighter to throw a barrage of punches. As we see here, Lyoto Machida finishing Rashad Evans from a square stance. Oscar De La Hoya, we'll see here that his stance squares up, throws a really, really fast combination, and leads to a knockdown. Again, a square stance means the feet are in line with one another, and if we were to draw a line up to the shoulders, we see that there is a type of square or boxed position to the stance. In this first variation of a switching stance hook, we start in a staggered stance and then I turn 90 degrees until my hip faces my partner. Again, look how the pivot happens in mid-air. Not grinding my foot into the ground, but rather hopping and pivoting in mid-air. You see hopping back and forth in mid-air. So, throw jab, cross, and then I pivot in mid-air. Here's a close-up of the footwork. Instead of grinding while I pivot, I actually hop, let my feet pivot in mid-air, which reduces friction and makes for a more powerful and effective pivot. Again, hopping back and forth, turning my stance 90 degrees. With this example, again, look how the fighter in red pushes off the back foot, turns his feet in mid-air, landing 90 degrees, and then hops right back to his regular stance. Let's see that from another angle. And again from the original angle in full speed. Here we see another example of this switching stance hook where the fighter turns about 90 degrees, and notice that he also propels himself forward as he throws the hook. Now we'll look at another switch stance hook, which is probably even more powerful due to the scissor step and the amount of loading. As you see here, I can load my legs, load my back, and put all of my body weight into this punch. Here, loading, and then switching stance, scissoring my feet in the air, exploding into that hook punch. Again, loading down, bending my knees, turning my back, lateral flexion, rotating my shoulders, putting all my body weight into that punch, generating a ton of momentum. This can be very effective when done when slipping. As you see here, slipping side to side, slipping towards my lead leg actually loads this hook. Here's a view from the rear. Notice the amount of loading again. Not only bending my knees, but turning my shoulders and loading my back into throwing the hook. Once again, notice how my feet switch leads in mid-air. Notice from another angle here, loading, switching my feet and exploding into the hook. One more time. There's no better example of this type of hook than watching Mike Tyson. Watch how Mike slips and then explodes into the hook, switching his stance in mid-air, landing a very powerful knockout hook. Let's see that example again from another angle. See his opponent jabs, Mike slips, loads his whole body, explodes in the hook, switching stance in mid-air, an extremely powerful knockout hook. One more time from another angle. Notice the slip, the load, exploding, feet switch in midair, and there's the hook. Here's another example with Sugar Ray Leonard throwing a barrage of punches, and here we go, switching stances, propelling himself forward for the knockout hook. Here's another angle. Here's another excellent example with Tyrone Spong. Notice how his legs switch in mid-air to generate power for the punch, and it helps to propel his weight forward into the hook punch. Again in slow motion. Look at the leg switch in mid-air, look at the forward propulsion. Excellent punch. Now let's take a look at the mechanics that every single hook will have in common. These are the common denominators of throwing a hook. From my typical stance, I'm not loaded to throw a hook. So step one is to load the punch through the hips and the shoulders. Step two is to load the punching arm by letting it travel away from the body. Step three is to begin to unwind or rotate through the hips and the shoulders, letting the arm lag behind. Step four is the elbow rotates at the very end to complete the punch, aim the punch, and add velocity. This simple formula can be applied to all hooks. Here's an example of a very tight and technical hook from Callum Smith. Here we see Callum Smith with his hands up in a good guard position. Now we see the hook begin. Step one is to rotate and load for the hook. Step two is to let the arm drop back to load the arm while the torso remains loaded. Step three is to begin to unwind by turning here through the torso while the punch is still lagging behind. As he continues to rotate, the punch lands, and step four, the elbow bends to complete the punch. Although this example is quite different from the last one, we will see the four basic elements still come into play.
And here it is. Look at that. It's just the counters over and over when they were.
We see Israel Adesanya here getting ready to throw a right hook, which is going to load up his left hook. The right hook lands, so step number one, he's loaded here through the torso for his left hook. In this particular example, given how close they are to each other, Israel actually leans back to further load his hook. You can see as he leans back even further, his arm begins to drop for step number two, which is loading the arm. Step number three, he begins to rotate through his torso while the arm is lagging behind. As he completes this rotation, the punch lands. And step number four, rotation or hinging continues through the elbow joint. As we see here, rotation is still happening through the elbow. Let's take a look at that amazing counter punch again. Here's another very similar example of this lean back counter hook with Oscar De La Hoya. Notice not only the similarities between this clip and the last one, but the four basic principles of all hooks. I would like to conclude this video by saying this is just one way to go about trying to explain and understand the science of the hook, which is probably the most difficult punch to teach or to try to dissect and understand. We are going to end with a quote from Bruce Lee. Before I learned the martial arts, a punch was just a punch and a kick was just a kick. When I studied the martial arts, a punch was no longer a punch and a kick was no longer just a kick. Now that I understand the martial arts, a punch is just a punch and a kick is just a kick.